Last week we learned about the MCAS issue, but I'll tell you the history of Boeing and McDonnell Douglas goes deeper than that. We'll explore that today. MzeroA Nation, Jason here. Homework for you. The viewerships can go down right there. I just said homework, right? Homework for you. If you did not watch last week's video, you need to watch it. There's a link in the description. If you didn't go on Netflix and watch the movie Downfall, I gave you two fun homework assignments. Go back and do that. Save this video for later. Netflix, the movie's called Downfall, and you need to watch last week's video on Boeing's MCAS issue with the 737 MAX. We're going to do a little bit of a history lesson here today. This is a longer video. I apologize. I know we're very quick, short, punchy videos normally, but you don't want to miss this because you think the MCAS stuff was deep. Wait till we dig deeper into the history, and I'm going to ask you the question at the end. Was this an event or was this a trend? I'll let you be the judge. Before we dive into this and show you what our amazing 3D animation team has been up to and our creative team, I want to remind you, please like and subscribe to us here on YouTube, on Facebook. Leave us a comment. Those comments are oxygen to keep us going. Maybe just leave me a comment. Did you do your homework? Yes, Jason, I did my homework. That's important for me to know too. Makes me feel good. All right, let's dive into our fun history lesson here together. On June 12, 1972, American Airlines Flight 96 took off at DTW. It was on its way to LaGuardia with a stopover in Buffalo. Now, mind you, we're flying DC10 number 5. It's piloted by veteran Captain Bryce McCormick, who had 24,000 flight hours, but just 56 hours in the DC10. His first officer, Peter Whitney, 8,000 flight hours, but just 75 in the DC-10. It's ship number 5, it's a new aircraft. And our flight engineer, Clayton Burke, 13,900 hours. Again, just 45 of those hours though in the DC-10. Captain McCormick later said to the FAA and the NTSB, he was certain that no one at American knew the DC-10 better than him. It's a big statement for a guy who has 56 hours in the airplane, right? He said he spent long nights, though, seriously, and this is a good pilot who's always learning. Listen to this. He spent just long nights studying the systems, and he actually realized there was one major flaw with the DC-10. There was no backup if the hydraulic system failed. And guess what? The rudder, the flaps, the elevators, useless because they all run off of hydraulic power. So he actually sought for an answer to the problem at America's DC-10 training facility in Fort Worth, where he discovered the plane had an exceptional ability to turn using just the engines. So he practiced how to manipulate the nose, sit in the sim, using just the thrust. We call that differential thrust technique. So to understand this better though, you need to understand more of the history like I was telling you. And the history going back to McDonnell Douglas, who later merges with Boeing, as you learned in our first video. But McDonnell Douglas was in a race to get this airplane out there and for sale. Did you know this airplane was actually created by committee? And let me tell you something, all the airlines wanted changes. How did we end up with McDonnell Douglas? Well, McDonnell was an outstanding aircraft company in its own right with the F-4 Phantom. Douglas, you know its popular DC-3 as well. You take this military powerhouse, really the Douglas Aircraft Company being the one who pioneered passenger travel with that, and you combine them together, you should have an outstanding company with that. But sometimes culture doesn't always pass over. Now, this particular DC-10 could hold up to 380 people. It was actually just lightly loaded that day with only 56 passengers and one casket. Weird fact, but we'll come back to that in a bit. Shortly after passing over Lake Erie, here's a fun fact for you. Erie is Iroquois for cat, for you cat lovers out there, near Windsor, Ontario. The fasten seatbelt sign clicked off through 10,000 feet. The flight attendants emerged from their seats. The plane now passed through 11,700 feet. Remember that altitude, MSL. And they were met with an explosion. The left rudder pedal slammed to the floor. The right rudder pedal came up with such force, Captain McCormick said it slammed his knee into his chest. Captain McCormick's first thought was they had a mid-air collision. However, it turned out to be something much more insidious, but just as devastating. The rear cargo door had blown out, ripping a rectangular hole in the side of the DC-10 big enough for it to suck the casket out of the airplane. It was found in a farmer's field days later. This rapid decompression, 11,000 feet, filled the aircraft with so much dust and debris flying everywhere that actually then caused the floor of the aircraft to collapse. "Let me have it," Captain McCormick shouts over the noise, just to find that all the controls are useless and the throttles had slipped back to idle. Reverting back to that training, he slammed the two wing engine throttles forward and the nose began to reverse out of that fatal descent. This gave him time to kind of figure out this dangerous yaw they had to the left. McCormick quickly also cut the fuel heading to the tail engine, taking it out of play, making the elevator only slightly more effective. The ailerons were responding to some input, but he said were sluggish at best. Realizing his options were limited, he opted to turn the DC-10 back around towards DTW using that differential engine technique he had practiced in the simulator just months earlier. With the aircraft now turned around, heading back towards DTW, McCormick picked up the PA system and as all the witnesses said, in a monotone, "This is your captain speaking" type voice, said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to apologize for the slight inconvenience. The plane is under control. We'll be making an emergency landing at DTW. This is the best part. Because of a problem with the plane, I'd like to assure you that new reservations will be arranged for you to your final destination." That's a good captain right there, right? Relying, back to our story here, relying on just the engines for steering. American Flight 96 was approaching the runway at 160 knots. Now, that's only about 20 knots faster than the normal prescribed approach speed. However, the speed was intentional because Captain McCormick knew that more speed meant greater directional control for the little bit of flight controls he did have, more air flowing over those control surfaces. However, as they approached short final, they realized they were high, and a go-around was not an option. Their descent rate went from a stable 300 feet per minute to 1,500 feet per minute. The only way to break this rapid descent was to increase the throttles, which is a byproduct, increased speed. The moment the wheels touched the ground, the jammed rudder once again came into play, causing the plane to slowly start drifting to the left, towards the main ramp, towards the terminal as they touched down at 160 knots. Now with no ability to stop, I have no brakes. Remember hydraulics. McCormick threw both engines into full reverse, but it still wasn't enough. As they screeched to a halt, they finally came to rest with just 980 feet of runway remaining. Thankfully, American Airlines Flight 96 had no fatalities, and some passengers and crew only suffered minor injuries. However, remember that coffin I told you about? It didn't fare as well. It fell some 11,000 feet, but it was the discovery of the coffin by a farmer in his field that led to the biggest find in this mysterious explosion, which was the rear cargo door found in the same field. Now, during this accident investigation by the NTSB, their star witness, it wasn't the captain or it wasn't actually any of the crew. It was a baggage handler named William Eggert. Eggert was super nervous, but willing to help. He told investigators that after the last piece of luggage was loaded, he pushed the button to close the cargo door electronically. He listened for 10 seconds to hear the click of the latches closing, since there was no way to visually check if the latches had secured. He was surprised, he said, when he went to pull down on the last manual handle and was met with some resistance. Now, the handle's job was then to drive a series of locking pins behind the electronic latches. However, this handle didn't want to go down, so he opened the door and he closed it again. Same issue. However, this time he used his knee to kind of force the handle into its slot. Eggert then stepped back, looked at the door and said, "It just doesn't look right." You ever been around an airplane and something just doesn't look right? So he called over one of his fellow mechanics who looked at it and said, "Don't worry, these DC-10s, they're new. It's a new door, it's gonna take some time to break in." But he still wasn't so sure. So he went and got someone else. He got his supervisor over, looked at the door and said, "It's a new door, don't worry about it." However, the door itself told a more complete story. All the vital locking mechanism components were actually undamaged. Only exception was actually the torque tube connected to the handle was bent, but not broken, from when Eggert shut the door with his knee, putting his weight into it. The shocking part was, though, all 4 latches were found in the locked position. They simply failed to go over dead center and actually latch. Instead, the latches were jammed against the spools that were meant to correct and give the door the illusion of actually being locked, and disabled the warning lights, by the way, in the cockpit. However, the door was very much far from locked. Now, McDonnell Douglas was super quick to go on the defense, pointing the blame against the baggage handler, saying, I'm sure they felt they had to. I mean, they were in such a race to get this DC-10 out. They had just spent $1 billion. Right, this is in the 70s. $1 billion on development in a race against companies like Lockheed and Boeing, and they couldn't afford a stain on their project so early. This was ship number 5. They were so focused on cutting costs, time, and weight. Early on, engineers determined that actually a standard plug door, it's just going to be too heavy. It also would take up valuable cargo space. So they opted for this outward opening door. In fact, during the design phase of the DC-10, the committee that created this airplane sent around a memorandum titled Reduce, Eliminate, Remove, Decrease, and Delete every feature that added weight. The plug-style door is a victim of this. Just 3 days into this investigation, the NTSB knew the cause of the near accident over Windsor. However, while it was being conducted, other DC-10s were taken off every single day. So the NTSB was hustling. They wasted no time sharing their findings with the FAA, fully expecting an AD and grounding of all DC-10s. However, the NTSB's advice fell on deaf ears. Executives at McDonnell Douglas issued the following statement in the days after Windsor. Flight 96 mishap, the Flight 96 mishap, that's what they called it, was not the result of a serious design flaw that required urgent attention. This was an isolated incident that would not be repeated if proper steps are taken to get the baggage handlers, those darn baggage handlers, to use their brains and not their brawn to deal with the door handles. Interesting. But what about this AD? You know, in 1972, the man in charge of the FAA was a gentleman named John Schaefer, appointed actually by President Nixon in 1969. But Schaefer was always at odds with the NTSB literally from the start. Now, although the NTSB gets unrestricted access to the crash site, their recommendations to the FAA are just that, recommendations. It's actually the job of the FAA to act. Now, prior to Schaefer, 88% of all NTSB recommendations were put into force. However, during Schaefer's time at the helm, only 64% of the NTSB's recommendations were used, much to the frustration of the NTSB. Now, during the 10 months the DC-10 had been in service, airlines made more than 100 reports of doors failing to close. Do the math on that. That's 10 reports a month. The engineers at McDonnell Douglas, they were unfazed by the reports. However, some at the FAA believed that something needed to be done. His name was Richard Sliff, and he was from the Western Field Office of the FAA. And he was on the NTSB side, and he believed we need an AD. This should be issued. He also knew that grounding all DC-10s during the busy summer season would be met with a lot of pushback. So he came up with kind of a stopgap procedure. His idea was to install a toughened glass kind of peephole that would allow baggage handlers to see inside the locking mechanism and be sure that it was over center and latched properly. He knew it wasn't a perfect solution. It would require baggage handlers to move their platforms even a little higher to check, and that doing checks at night would require a flashlight, but he thought it was good enough to buy them some time while they worked on a solution to rework the entire door system. So just 4 days, and they put this together quickly, 4 days after the Windsor accident, Richard Sliff arrived at his office early, typed up his proposed AD, and sent it along to Washington, D.C. He was met with no opposition by his boss out in California or anyone along the way. He didn't realize, though, but the next day his AD had ended up in a Washington, D.C. trash can. The next day, then, he received a phone call from McDonnell Douglas CEO Jackson McGowan, who explained to him that, listen, sir, no AD is needed. I just had a great call with FAA Director Schaefer, from the FAA, and we agreed that the installation of a peephole, it's a good idea. We're going to issue this as a service bulletin instead. Now, let me turn on online ground school mode real quick. AD versus service bulletin. ADs, this is required. You must do this every however many hours, whatever it is, inspections, whatever it may be. Service bulletins, This is a good recommendation. This is a good idea. We recommend you follow it, but not required. I actually was able to track down some of these service bulletins, and you can see them here as well. You can even see recommended. Wow. Now, so this was followed up. All these service bulletins then came out with Service Bulletin 5237, which recommended an aluminum support plate be installed, which made it impossible for the door to close if the latches were not in place. So just months after the mishap, that's again McDonnell Douglas's words, not mine, no airline wanted to paint their colors on 6 DC-10s that the company had completed and were in that primer green awaiting a buyer at their Long Beach, California factory. One buyer had actually already backed out of the deal, and CEO McGowan, he became directly involved in getting these aircraft off the balance sheet and into a customer's fleet. He had the interest actually of Turkish Airlines, known as TTHY. However, TTHY was shopping between the DC-10 and their competitor, the L-1011. Desperate to make the sale, McGowan took $1 million off the sale price of the airplane and his personal promise that the cargo doors sold to TTHY would have the proper modifications. You see where we're going with this? Listen to this one. As the final tactic, TTHY came back and asked McDonnell Douglas to waive the $400,000 charge for crew training, and it wanted its crew trained in 12 weeks rather than the standard 2 years, like McDonnell Douglas was doing with more established European carriers like KLM and Lufthansa. Also, TTHY could gain wide body market share and cash in on the holidays coming up here. You're going to take what takes 2 years, condense it into 12 weeks. Okay, write that fact down for a bit. Despite this unreasonable timeline, McDonnell Douglas, they were desperate to make the sale. So they agreed, and Ship 29 was painted in TTHY's colors, and unfortunately continues our story. A year and a half since the Windsor mishap on March 3rd, 1974, stranded passengers at Paris's Orly Airport managed to buy a ticket on TTHY 981. The stranded passengers were there as a byproduct of a strike by British European Airways, leaving flights to London scarce. TTHY, of course, well, they were happy to sell tickets for its unsold seats on Flight 981 to London. As Flight 981 boarded, baggage handler Muhammad Mahmoudi was in charge of loading the aft baggage compartment. Once he received the all clear, he took his platform up the 17 feet in the air and began the process of closing the door. Mahmoudi was actually very familiar with the notoriously difficult doors and knew if he encountered any resistance that the latches were not over center and he shouldn't force it. However, he had never been instructed about this door latch peephole or even how to use it. Despite speaking 3 different languages, English wasn't one of them. And the placard, the instructions for that peephole, were in English. McDonnell Douglas, fun fact, actually later in court tried to say that the baggage handler was illiterate. He was quickly shot down when he told him, "I speak 3 languages." Unlike Flight 96 though, Mahmoudi encountered no resistance and assumed the door was latched properly. It was later discovered by investigators that the door locking pins had been adjusted and literally, listen to this, filed down to make the door easier to close. It was difficult to close, so we kind of filed it down a little bit. We wanted to make the door easier to close. Now, this result of this misguided tinkering, the same tinkering also disabled the door warning light, making it inoperative. TTHY actually said the door light proved to be more of a nuisance, and it was on even when the door was closed properly. So the apparent solution was, let's fiddle with it and the locking system, the micro switches, so it doesn't bother us anymore. So with the door believed to be closed, our crew begins their taxi out. We're piloted, by the way, by the first Turkish DC-10 pilots on record. All very accomplished pilots and veterans of the Turkish Air Force. Captain Burkaz, 7,003 hours, First Officer Olsman, 5,589 hours, and Flight Engineer Ozer with 2,113 hours. All were members of this original 12-week expedited training at the McDonnell Douglas plant in Long Beach. The weather, by the way, it was perfect for a quick 215 nautical mile flight across the English Channel. At 12:31 p.m., Flight 981 was cleared for takeoff and a climb to 4,000 feet. 3 minutes later, they are handed off to Paris Control and cleared to climb to their cruising altitude of 23,000 feet. Then at 12:39 and 56 seconds, passing through 11,500 feet. Flight 96 was 11,700 feet. At 11,500 feet, disaster struck. While no emergency was declared, Paris Control knew something was wrong as they watched the tiny radar blip of Flight 981 turn into 2 blips side by side. 70 seconds later, both radar blips disappeared from the screen. Paris Control tried to reach Flight 981 8 times, but only received back a garbled transmission, which was later determined to be the pilots shouting at each other in Turkish. Like Flight 96, the passenger floor broke in half. And again, Flight 96 only had 56 passengers, while Flight 981 was fully loaded with 335 passengers, causing a much more devastating effect. Having lost all flight control functions and unable to use Flight 96 differential throttle technique as both wing engines were stuck at idle because of the increased damage to Flight 981 compared to 96, the only working engine was the tail engine, and their only other option was to put it in full reverse to slow their descent, even though their nose was down 20 degrees. The crash site was spread a half-mile long due to the impact at 430 knots. Another odd similarity to Flight 96 was that same cargo door was found a few days later by a farmer working his turnip fields. Upon inspection of the door, no aluminum support plate was found on the door or in the wreckage, the same plate modification promised by the CEO of McDonnell Douglas. Now, despite the negativity in the press, McDonnell Douglas stood by its mantra this was an accident caused by an illiterate baggage handler. You can find newspaper headlines that say that. It's crazy. A notion that caused Mahmoudi, the baggage handler, to receive death threats and even calls for his arrest. As French, British, and American investigators arrived on the scene, they began to ask questions, tracing the history of Ship 29. They asked the question, how does an aircraft that was still in the factory after the Windsor accident get delivered to an airline while the factory itself was issuing these service bulletins for modifications that it wasn't even doing itself? Well, on Thursday, March 7th, 4 days after the crash, the FAA finally saw the light and issued an AD against the DC-10, making the service bulletin modifications mandatory. This time around, though, investigators stopped at nothing and began mandatory inspections of all DC-10s, started in Europe since they were already there, with an inspection of Flight 991's sister ship, sold to Laker Airways of London, also in that original 6 that was unsold. Guess what? They found the aluminum support plate not installed there either, despite coming from the factory after TTHY's delivery. As the dust settled and the court proceedings began, 3 inspectors employed by McDonnell Douglas were deposed under oath. Their job would have included them inspecting the cargo doors of the 6 aircraft, those that left the factory. In fact, in the log of Ship 29, the cargo door was stamped approved to have all modifications by Edward Evans. However, Mr. Evans testified that he had never even seen Ship 29. His stamp, which he claims was in his desk under lock and key, was used without his authorization. By whom? Is still unknown to this day. Investigators found even more damaging evidence in McDonnell Douglas's paperwork. That on March 29th, 1970, during the testing phase of ship number 1, it was taken outside of its hangar for the first time to test the air conditioning and pressurization systems. The cargo doors were latched, front and rear, and the pressurization system test began, only to end early and dramatically as the front cargo door blew out, damaging the cabin floor, ripping the door from its hinges, just like Flight 96 and Flight 991. This study, however, was quickly buried and listed as classified and called a freak accident. However, you would think someone would have spoken up after Flight 96 over Windsor. Now, the DC-10 continued on with a tarnished reputation, and its weakness of the hydraulic system and lack of backups persisted. Just 5 years after Paris, an American Airlines flight leaving Chicago O'Hare had its left engine pylon ripped from the left wing, severing the hydraulic system, causing a near instantaneous stall. The more famous Sioux City crash of 1989 of United Airlines 232, when a hairline fracture in the fan disc of the tail caused the engine to disintegrate, losing the hydraulically actuated rudder, ailerons, spoilers, and elevators. There are currently 44 DC-10s left flying, all in cargo service, not including the US Air Force KC-10s, of which there are 55. Now, to take this back full circle, I know you did your homework and watched the movie Downfall like I told you. Well, then you know in 1996, 1997, McDonnell Douglas merged with a little company called Boeing. In fact, that's how we actually get the Boeing logo that we all know here today. You can see the McDonnell Douglas logo there, kind of as the pictorial portion of it, with Boeing then added to it. Did some of these cultural things continue on, this idea of just keeping things under the rug? And let me tell you, this isn't an attack on Boeing or on McDonnell Douglas formerly or anything along those lines. This is simply just looking at the facts. And how can we learn from this as pilots? Well, let me tell you something. What happens in the book and what happens out there in the real world can often be two totally different things. And I need you just to slow down and learn everything you can about your aircraft. I know you may be certificated for airplane single engine land, but if you've ever switched from a 172 to a Cirrus, let me tell you, it's a different animal. And vice versa, from a Cirrus to a 172. I know your cert says airplane single engine land, but that's a big old category of aircraft and class of aircraft out there. And you need to get that time in type. Don't rush through that training. Don't take training that takes 2 years and try to condense it into 12 weeks. Learn everything you can. Get your hands dirty at the maintenance shop with your annual inspections. Learn how to do the basics of preventative maintenance. Learn everything you can about your aircraft and everything about your craft, right, of what we're doing, whether this is a hobby or a career for you. But ultimately, I want to hear your take about this. Leave me a comment down below. What is your big takeaway? You're a good pilot who's always learning. What is your main takeaway from all of this? I hope you're loving this series. You know you can take a free trial of our online ground school by going to MzeroAtrial.com. If you love my teaching style, if that clicks for you, check all of that out. Have a blessed, abundant, outstanding rest of your day. And most importantly, remember that a good pilot is always learning. Have a great day, everybody. I'll see you.